What did the doctor say?
Everything's fine, Mother. The baby is growing well.
The war ended on a quiet morning without gunfire, but the city still woke up afraid. No big parades. No laughter ringing through the ruined streets. Just a long, heavy silence, as though the whole town was holding its breath, waiting for something even worse to come. Vivian Moore stood outside the Moore family gate, one hand resting on her swollen belly, breathing hard. She stood there a very long time, so long the patrol soldiers down the block had already changed shifts, and still she couldn't bring herself to knock. This was the house she had once entered as a young bride. Back then the iron gate was new, the walls clean, the flag on the porch a promise of safety, not a warning. Now everything felt different. The gate seemed more like a border than a doorway. The high wall reminded anyone who looked that this was the home of a family that had stood on the winning side, and anyone who wanted to come in had better prove they belonged. At last Vivian raised her hand and knocked. The dry sound echoed in the gray morning light. The door opened slowly, as though someone had been waiting a long while. Eleanor Moore stood there, back straight as a ruler in her plain black dress. Her silver hair was pinned neatly, not a strand out of place. Her eyes were sharp and deep, they lingered on Vivian's belly just a second longer than necessary. "You've come," Eleanor said. Not a hello. Not a question. Just a cold acknowledgement. "Yes, Mother," Vivian answered softly, head bowed. Eleanor turned without another word and walked inside. Vivian understood, that was the only invitation she would receive. Inside the house the air smelled of old wood and silence. The furniture hadn't changed since before the war. On the main wall hung two photographs side by side, an older man in uniform, and a young man with a steady, determined gaze, her husband, Thomas Moore. Vivian lowered her eyes as she passed the pictures. She had done it many times, but it never felt easy. They sat facing each other in the living room. Eleanor poured tea with slow, careful movements. She didn't offer Vivian a cup. Vivian didn't touch the one set before her. "What did the doctor say?" Eleanor asked, eyes never leaving Vivian's stomach. "Everything's fine, Mother. The baby is growing well." Eleanor gave the tiniest nod. Her gaze darkened, as though she were weighing something heavy. "When is the baby due?" "About 3 weeks." Eleanor set her teacup down. The soft clink rang loud in the quiet room. She looked straight into Vivian's eyes. "Thomas has been dead 7 months." The words fell between them like a knife without blood. Vivian felt her heart tighten, but her face stayed calm, years of practice. "Yes," she said quietly. "Time passes fast," Eleanor went on, voice even. "So fast that people can get many things confused." Vivian didn't answer. She bowed her head, fingers tightly laced over her belly. Thomas was not the father of this child. The truth had never been spoken out loud, but it lived in every breath Vivian drew. It hung between the two women, so heavy the air seemed to thicken. Eleanor stood and walked to the small family altar in the corner. She lit a stick of incense. The smoke rose, veiling her face for a moment. "The war taught me many things," Eleanor said, still with her back to Vivian. "One lesson stands above the rest." She turned. Her eyes locked on Vivian. "The enemy isn't always on the other side of the line." A cold shiver ran down Vivian's back. "There are enemies," Eleanor continued, "who stand very close. So close you don't see them until you've lost everything." Vivian gripped her hands tighter. She couldn't tell if Eleanor was speaking of Thomas, of the war, or of her. Maybe all three. "I only hope," Eleanor said slowly, "that this child truly carries more blood." Silence settled again. Vivian had no words. Anything she might say now would be both useless and dangerous. Night fell quickly. Outside, the steady boots of patrolling soldiers sounded like the heartbeat of a country that had never truly found peace. Vivian lay on the old bed in the room that had once been theirs, hers and Thomas's. A long crack ran across the ceiling, a scar from the last shelling of the war. She laid her hand on her belly, feeling the small movements inside. "You're not to blame," she whispered, voice trembling just a little. "No matter whose blood you carry." In the darkness, memory came flooding back. Not of Thomas, but of another man. Captain Richard Hale. An officer of the other side. A name that, if spoken inside these walls, would be a death sentence for her and the child. The short meetings. The silent looks. The arrangements hidden beneath pretended emotion. Vivian had once thought she was in control. She had been trained as a spy, no attachments, no love, no hesitation. But this child had broken every rule she knew. The next morning Eleanor was already standing in the doorway when Vivian woke. "Get ready," she said. "We're going to church today." Vivian sat up, heart suddenly pounding. A vague, nagging unease rose inside her. "What for, Mother?" "Prayer," Eleanor answered. "And to prepare for the naming. This child will carry the Moore name." Vivian nodded. She understood, from this moment forward, nothing would be in her hands anymore. Some secrets cannot stay buried forever, not in a country just stepping out of war, where the winners are always afraid the losers might rise again. And the child inside her, even before it took its first breath, was already a threat. Not because of who its father was, but because it was living proof of a truth both sides desperately wanted to forget. The baby was born on a rainy night when the city lay in darkness and the army guard posts still glowed like eyes that never close. A distant siren wailed, not for battle, but because a new spy hunt had begun in the southern district. Vivian labored in silence. No wailing, no panic. She clenched her teeth and gripped the hand of the only midwife still working at the hospital after the war. The pains came in waves, but what made Vivian tremble wasn't the physical agony. It was the quiet dread that had lived inside her for months. She had always feared this moment. Because when the child first cried, it wouldn't just be a new life entering the world. It would be a secret finally stepping into the light. "Push, Mrs. Moore," the midwife whispered. "Just a little more." Vivian nodded, sweat soaking her forehead. At the height of the worst contraction, the face of Captain Richard Hale appeared in her mind, sharp and clear. Not in uniform, not with the cold stare of an officer, but as the man who had once laid his hand on her belly and murmured, "If anything happens, don't let them take the child." Then the cry came, thin and piercing, tearing through the rain. The baby arrived in the exact instant the city lost power. A tiny, red, fragile life, crying weakly in the flickering light of an oil lamp. Vivian burst into tears along with him. She couldn't hold it back any longer. Her hands shook as she reached out to touch her son, afraid that even a second's delay would let someone steal him away. "It's a boy," the midwife said softly. Vivian closed her eyes. A son. A child who carried blood from both sides, and belonged to neither. Eleanor arrived at the hospital just as dawn began to gray the sky. She walked into the delivery room with the same rigid posture she always carried, but when she saw the infant in Vivian's arms, her eyes faltered for one brief, unguarded moment. The baby was too small. Too fragile. And, terribly, he did not look like Thomas. Eleanor never said it aloud, but she looked carefully. She studied the slightly high bridge of the nose. The lighter skin. The tiny hands clutching Vivian's finger as though clinging to life itself. "Is the boy healthy?" Eleanor asked. "Yes," the midwife answered for Vivian. "Mother and child are both fine." Eleanor nodded. She stepped closer and stood beside the bed for a long time. Vivian held the baby tight, heart pounding. She waited, for a question, an accusing glance. But Eleanor only said, "We'll take him home." The Moore house had never been so quiet as in the days that followed. The baby slept peacefully, but every time he cried, Vivian startled as though the sound might bring the whole world crashing down. She never let him out of her sight. Every night she stayed awake, listening to the smallest noise beyond the gate. Eleanor watched everything. She rarely held the child. She offered no cuddles, no soft whispers. But she was always there. Her eyes followed every detail, the way Vivian nursed him, the way she rocked him to sleep, the way Vivian tensed whenever someone knocked unexpectedly at the door. One afternoon Eleanor brought home an old wooden cradle. "It was Thomas's," she said shortly. "When he was little." Vivian froze. She laid the baby in the cradle that had once belonged to the man who was not his father, and her heart twisted. Eleanor stood watching the scene for a long time. "We need to name him," she said. "The sooner the better." Vivian looked up. "Mother?" "The naming ceremony," Eleanor continued. "The Moore family cannot afford gossip." Vivian understood. In the aftermath of war, everything was watched, judged. A child born into the family of an officer could not be left in ambiguity. She nodded. "I'll prepare." But from that moment, strange things began to happen. Soldiers stood guard closer to the house than usual. Unfamiliar eyes followed Vivian whenever she stepped onto the porch with the baby. One evening Eleanor found a small folded slip of paper slipped under the door, blank, no writing, but folded in a very particular way. Eleanor held the paper without speaking. Her face changed. That night she did not sleep. Vivian knew Eleanor suspected. Not because of one clear sign, but because of all the details that didn't fit, the timing, the appearance, Vivian's excessive anxiety whenever the military appeared. One morning while Vivian was rocking the baby to sleep, Eleanor stepped into the room. "Did you meet anyone in the final months of the war?" Eleanor asked directly. Vivian looked up, heart slamming. "Mother?" "Anyone," Eleanor said slowly. "Besides Thomas." The air in the room turned thick. The baby stirred and gave a small cry. "No," Vivian answered, sounding more certain than she felt. "I was at the hospital the whole time." Eleanor studied her for a very long moment. Then she turned away. "Good," she said. "Because I will not forgive anyone who takes advantage of my son's death." Vivian bowed her head. For the first time, she felt fear not only from the army, but from this very woman. A few days later Eleanor announced, "The naming ceremony will be this Sunday. I have invited representatives from the military." The words hung in the air like a sentence waiting to be carried out. Vivian held the baby closer, heart seeming to stop. She understood now, the naming was not just a family ritual. It was a test. A trap. The night before the ceremony, Vivian did not sleep. She sat by the window, watching patrol lights sweep across the empty street. The baby slept in her arms, breathing evenly. "If tomorrow I'm no longer here," Vivian whispered, "you have to live." She didn't know whether she was speaking to her son or to herself. Because she could feel it very clearly. Tomorrow, it would not only be the child's name that was spoken aloud. It might also be the truth itself that finally got called by name. The church bells rang that Sunday morning slow and heavy, like the breathing of a city still trying to recover from the war. The sound rolled out across streets scarred with bullet holes, slipping into every house, every mind still full of caution. The naming ceremony for the Moore child took place in a strange atmosphere. There was no laughter to welcome a new life, no warm family joy. Instead there were watchful eyes, rows of neatly pressed uniforms, and a silence so thick it felt hard to breathe. Vivian sat in the front pew, the baby wrapped in a white blanket, resting quietly in her arms. His little face was so peaceful it made her heart ache. He knew nothing about the stares fixed on him, nothing about how this ceremony was not only about giving him a name, it was also the moment the truth would be dragged into the open. Eleanor sat beside her, back ramrod straight, hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked neither at Vivian nor at the child. Her gaze was fixed straight ahead, toward the group of military officers standing at attention near the altar. Among them were faces Vivian didn't recognize. They weren't from this area. They weren't the usual guests for a simple naming. Eleanor had noticed that from the beginning. When the priest began the opening prayers, the heavy church doors closed with a soft click. A metallic sound followed, dry, but clear enough for the most sensitive ears to understand. The building had been sealed. Vivian felt her heart skip. She bent down and kissed the baby's forehead very gently. "No matter what happens," she whispered, "you have to live." The priest stopped mid-sentence as an officer stepped forward. He didn't draw a weapon, but his presence alone froze the air inside the church. "Forgive the interruption," the officer said, voice low and steady. "But we need to verify certain information regarding the Moore family." A few murmurs rippled through the pews. Eleanor lifted her chin. "My family has given enough to this country," she said. "If you have doubts, speak plainly." The officer nodded. His eyes shifted to Vivian. "We suspect this woman," he said, "of having ties to an enemy espionage network." The room seemed to shatter. Vivian didn't react at once. She had waited for this moment far too long. She simply held her son closer, as though he were the only thing still anchoring her to the world. "Where is your evidence?" Eleanor asked. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut like ice. The officer signaled. A soldier stepped forward and handed over a thin file. Inside were scattered pieces, hospital duty logs, brief periods of unexplained absence, a coded message found on a strangely folded slip of paper. And finally, a name. Captain Richard Hale. Eleanor felt a faint wave of dizziness. That name was not unfamiliar. It had appeared in military reports, tied to battles that had cost her husband and son their lives. "The child," the officer continued, "is the son of Richard Hale." A soft gasp came from somewhere behind. But Vivian did not cry. She raised her head, her eyes calm in a way that was almost frightening. "Yes," she said. One word, and everything collapsed. Eleanor turned to look at Vivian. For the first time since the war ended, she could not hide the emotion in her eyes. Not explosive anger, but a deep, wordless pain. "Why?" Eleanor asked, voice rough. Vivian met her gaze straight on. "Because of the war," she said. "And because of the things war forces people to do." The officer motioned for the soldiers to move in. But before they could touch her, Vivian stood. Very carefully, she placed the baby into Eleanor's arms. "Please, Mother," Vivian said, and for the first time her voice trembled. "Don't let them take him." Eleanor's arms closed around the child by instinct. The small, warm body felt strangely alive against her. In that single moment, she no longer saw an enemy, no longer saw sides. She saw only an innocent life, breathing steadily, depending entirely on someone else's mercy. "The child is not guilty," Eleanor said loudly, turning to face the officers. "If you wish to judge someone, let him go." The officer hesitated. At last he gave a short nod. Vivian was taken away that same morning. No handcuffs, but also no chance to look back at her son one last time. When the door of the military vehicle closed, she shut her eyes and took a deep breath. She had prepared herself for this ending. The trial was swift. The post-war years had little patience for those labeled traitors. Vivian did not deny the charges. She made only one request, that the child be allowed to live under a different name, free of the shadow of hatred. The request was granted, partly because Eleanor Moore stood as guarantor, partly because the military understood that mishandling the child could turn him into a far more dangerous symbol. The day Vivian was sentenced, the sky did not rain. Eleanor did not attend. She stayed home, holding the baby in her arms, watching pale sunlight come through the window. The child slept very peacefully. She named him Lucas Moore. Not Hale. Not any name that would call the war back to life. Just Moore. In the years that followed, the city slowly came back to life. Guard posts were dismantled. Old flags were replaced with new symbols. Lucas grew up in the house that had once been full of bitterness, but he was raised in silence and kindness. Eleanor aged quickly. But every time she watched Lucas run and play on the porch, she knew she had made the right choice. The war had taken her son. But the child of the enemy had finally ended the war inside her heart. And that was how peace, at long last, began. The city entered its first post-war spring without fireworks, without festivals, and without the sense of relief people had once hoped for. The streets were patched in haste, walls hastily painted over, but beneath the fresh coats, the memories remained cracked and raw. Eleanor Moore stood on the front porch holding Lucas, watching the workmen dismantle the last military checkpoint at the end of the street. Metal clanged against metal and dry, sharp echoes, sounds that reminded her of church bells on the Sunday Vivian was taken away. Lucas was just over a year old now. He grew quickly, sturdy and healthy, with bright, unusually quiet eyes. He didn't cry much, didn't laugh loudly. Eleanor often thought perhaps he had been born with a natural caution, as though the world had never allowed him the luxury of being carefree. She set Lucas down on the rug so he could play with Thomas's old wooden blocks. Watching him, she felt a sudden sharp pain in her chest. Thomas should have sat here once, playing with those same blocks. Vivian should have stood here, watching. But war leaves no room for should have. After the verdict, the Moore house became a place quietly watched. No more open soldiers at the gate, but Eleanor knew perfectly well, every movement she made was under observation. They never fully trusted a widow who had sheltered the child of the enemy. Eleanor didn't care. The only thing that mattered to her now was Lucas. She raised him with the discipline of someone who had spent a lifetime in the military, yet also with a tenderness she herself hadn't known she possessed. She taught him simple things: be silent when necessary, observe before acting, and never ask too many questions in public. Lucas learned quickly. Some nights Eleanor woke to the sound of a child whispering. She would step into his room and find Lucas sitting up in bed, clutching the small silver bracelet Vivian had once worn. "Mommy?" he asked. Eleanor froze. She had never taught him to call her that. "Who did you dream about?" she asked, voice low. "A lady," Lucas answered innocently. "She told me to be good." Eleanor turned away. She didn't want Lucas to see her eyes in that moment. Vivian had vanished from the world, but never from the memories of those who remained. Whispers began when Lucas reached school age. People murmured that the boy didn't look like Thomas. That he had the eyes of the other side. That Eleanor Moore had betrayed her own son's memory. Eleanor heard it all. She never explained. Never argued. She only held Lucas's hand a little tighter whenever they passed those stairs. One afternoon a young officer came to the house. He was polite, but his eyes searched everything. "We just want to make sure," he said, "that the boy is being raised properly." "Properly?" Eleanor repeated. Without being influenced by incorrect ideas. Eleanor looked straight into his eyes. "The boy is taught one thing only," she said. "To be a decent human being." The young officer fell silent. He found no reason to stay longer. That night, Eleanor opened the old wooden box where she kept what little remained of Vivian, a blank folded note, an old handkerchief, and an unsent letter. "If one day my child survives, please tell him I didn't choose a side. I only chose him." Eleanor folded the letter carefully and placed it in the hand of the sleeping Lucas. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. "Your mother was not a traitor." Lucas didn't answer. But his small hand closed gently around the paper. The years passed slowly. The city gradually forgot the war, but Lucas was never allowed to forget. He grew up surrounded by half-told stories, by long silences whenever anyone mentioned the past. One day Lucas asked, "Grandma, who was my father?" Eleanor was quiet for a very long time. "Your father," she said at last, "was a man who died because grown-ups made terrible mistakes." Lucas nodded, as though he were already used to answers that didn't quite finish. But that night Eleanor sat a long time by the window. She understood, one day Lucas would need to know the whole truth. And when that day came, she wasn't sure she would have the strength to tell it. Because the truth wasn't only about Vivian or Richard Hale. It was about an entire generation that had traded their children's future for flags. Eleanor closed the window and turned to look at Lucas sleeping. "The war is over," she whispered. But the rest, that belongs to you. Lucas turned 10 in the year the city officially removed the label, postwar zone, from its signs. The last warning boards came down, the final checkpoints disappeared one quiet morning that felt almost too peaceful to be trusted. People said peace had lasted long enough now that guns were no longer needed. Eleanor Moore did not believe such announcements. She stood by the window watching Lucas sling his old school bag over his shoulder and step through the gate. He was taller than the year before, thin but strong, his eyes always scanning before he moved, a habit Eleanor had taught him before he even knew how to read. Don't talk too much. Don't trust people right away. And if anyone ever asks about your mother, come straight home. Lucas had never asked why. That morning, Eleanor felt an unease she couldn't name, not a clear fear, but the stillness that comes right before a storm, when the air holds its breath too long. She was not mistaken. That afternoon, when Lucas still hadn't returned, there came 3 knocks at the door. Even. Certain. Eleanor opened it and knew at once the man standing there was no neighbor. He wore a dark coat, no uniform, but the way he stood, straight, closed off, accustomed to giving orders, was unmistakable. My name is Samuel Reed, he said. I used to work in wartime intelligence. Eleanor did not invite him in. She stood blocking the doorway. The war is over, she told him. If you've come to dig up graves, you've come to the wrong house. Samuel Reed gave a small smile. I've come because the war isn't over for everyone. His eyes flicked past her into the house, pausing on Lucas's little toy car left on the step. The boy is still here, he said, not a question. Eleanor felt her hands go cold. What do you want? She asked directly. Samuel Reed drew a thin envelope from his coat. He didn't hand it over yet, he simply held it between 2 fingers, a quiet reminder that he possessed something she did not want to see. Captain Richard Hale, he said slowly. He did not die in the war. Eleanor made no outward reaction. But inside her, an old door she had long thought locked was suddenly kicked wide open. Hale disappeared after his side lost, Samuel went on. No body, no record of execution. We thought he'd slipped across the border. And? Eleanor asked. And 3 months ago, Samuel said, we received a signal. He handed her the envelope. Inside was a blurry photograph. A man standing in profile, hair now streaked with gray, but the eyes, Eleanor could never forget those eyes. They had appeared in blood-soaked reports. They had taken her husband and son. He's alive, Samuel said. And he's looking for his son. Eleanor slammed the door shut. She leaned back against it, heart pounding. All these years she had learned to live with memory, but she had never prepared herself for its return. Lucas came home late that day. Grandma, he said, setting his bag down, someone asked me about my mother today. Eleanor spun around. Who? A man, Lucas answered. He said he used to know her. The air in the room seemed to freeze. What did he ask? Eleanor said, struggling to keep her voice steady. He asked if I liked living here. Lucas hesitated. Asked if I ever thought about leaving. Eleanor gripped his shoulders. What did you tell him? I said. I have you. Lucas looked up. And I don't want to go anywhere. Eleanor pulled him close, holding him tighter than necessary. That night she did not sleep. Samuel Reed did not return, but his presence lingered in the house like smoke. Eleanor knew very well, if Hale was alive, then the fragile calm she had guarded for 10 years was only a thin shell. She opened the old wooden box again. Vivian's letter was still there. If one day my child must choose, please don't let him be forced to stand on any side. Eleanor folded the letter closed. For the first time, she understood that some things cannot be protected by silence alone. In the days that followed, Lucas began to notice the change in her. Eleanor let him go out less. Familiar streets suddenly felt forbidden. Questions about the past were met with long silences. What are you afraid of, Grandma? He asked one evening. Eleanor looked at him for a long time. "I'm afraid you'll be pulled into things that don't belong to you," she said. "But whose child am I?" Lucas asked, very softly. The question had finally arrived. Eleanor turned away. She was not ready. But she knew her time was growing short. A few days later, an unmarked letter appeared under the Moore door. Only one short line. Time to return what was stolen. Eleanor burned the letter in the fireplace. But the flames could not erase its meaning. The past had found its way back. And this time, it was not aiming at her. It was aiming at Lucas. Eleanor watched the boy sleeping, his face peaceful, unaware that his life was about to stand at another crossroads, one Vivian had tried with all her strength to prevent. "I won't let them take you," Eleanor whispered. "Even if I have to break everything." Outside, the wind rose. No longer the wind of war. But the wind of truth, something no one can keep locked away forever. Eleanor Moore had always believed that silence was a form of protection. She had lived nearly her whole life by that belief, long enough to turn it into discipline, into habit, into the only way she knew how to survive after the war. But on the morning Lucas turned 11, Eleanor came to a belated understanding. Some truths are not broken by gunfire, they are broken by time itself. Lucas stood before the mirror in his room, slowly buttoning his shirt. He was nearly as tall as Eleanor now, still slender but solid, his eyes no longer those of a child. He looked at his own reflection for a long time, as though searching for something he couldn't quite name. Eleanor stood quietly in the doorway, watching. "Grandma," Lucas said without turning around, "do I look like my father?" The question came so suddenly it caught her off guard. Eleanor felt her heart sink, but she refused to retreat. "You look like yourself," she answered. "That's enough." Lucas gave the smallest of smiles, but it didn't last. "The man from the other day," he continued, voice steady, "he came back." Eleanor's fingers tightened on the doorframe. "Where?" she asked. "Near the school," Lucas said. "He didn't speak to me. He just stood and watched." A long silence stretched between grandmother and grandson. Eleanor stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. "Starting today," she said slowly, "you won't go anywhere alone." Lucas turned to face her. "You're afraid." "Yes," Eleanor admitted. "And you need to trust me." Lucas asked no more questions. But Eleanor could feel the trust between them beginning to crack. In the days that followed, the invisible presence around the Moore house grew more noticeable. Strange cars parked at the end of the street. Unfamiliar faces appeared at the corner store they had always gone to. Eleanor realized the quiet life she had worked so hard to maintain was being slowly strangled. Samuel Reed returned one gray afternoon. "I warned you," he said when Eleanor opened the door. "Hale is not a patient man." "What does he want?" Eleanor asked. "He wants his son," Samuel answered plainly. "And he wants the rest of the agreement Vivian Moore carried to her grave." Eleanor felt a cold wave spread through her body. "There was no agreement," she said. "There was only a child." Samuel looked at her, all trace of courtesy gone from his eyes. "Vivian was the last keeper of the final communication codes between the remnants," he said. "The boy isn't just a son. He's a key." "No," Eleanor said, shaking her head. "He's only Lucas." Samuel was silent for a moment. Then he spoke very quietly. "Hale will not stop." That night, Eleanor called Lucas to the kitchen table, something she had avoided for years. She set a cup of warm tea in front of him, her hands trembling just a little. "You're old enough now," she said, "to hear part of the truth." Lucas said nothing. He waited. "The woman who gave birth to you," Eleanor continued, "was named Vivian Moore." Lucas nodded. "I know. But your father," Eleanor paused, "was not Thomas." The room fell into absolute silence. Lucas didn't react immediately. He looked down at his hands, then up again. "So who is my father?" he asked. Eleanor closed her eyes for one long breath. A man who stood on the other side of the war, she said. A man who caused a great deal of suffering. Lucas sat very straight. He's still alive. It wasn't a question. Eleanor looked directly into his eyes. For the first time, she didn't look away. Yes. Lucas stood up. He walked a few steps across the room, then stopped. So my mother, his voice cracked. My mother died because of him? Eleanor didn't answer right away. She rose, walked to him, and placed a hand on his shoulder. Your mother died, she said slowly, because she chose to protect you. Lucas bowed his head. A long quiet followed. You knew from the beginning, Lucas said. You knew everything. Yes, Eleanor admitted. And you still kept me. Yes. Lucas turned to face her, and for the first time there was anger in his eyes. What right did you have? That question hurt more than any verdict Eleanor had ever heard. Because you were an innocent child, she answered. And because someone had to break the cycle. Lucas gave a short, bitter laugh. You didn't break it, he said. You only delayed it. That night, Lucas didn't sleep. He opened the old wooden box Eleanor had kept hidden for so long. Vivian's letter was still there, yellowed with age. If you are reading this, it means I am no longer here. But you don't have to choose a side. You only have to choose to become the person you want to be. Lucas folded the letter very carefully. The next morning, Eleanor found the bed empty. Lucas was gone. He had taken nothing, no clothes, no money. Only Vivian's letter. Samuel Reed called that same morning. Hale has made contact, he said. The boy has gone to him. Eleanor let the telephone fall from her hand. She stood motionless for a long time in the empty house. Everything she had done, every sacrifice, every silence, every act of protection, had not been enough to stop the truth from finding its own path. Eleanor put on her coat and stepped outside. She knew, from this moment forward, the story no longer belonged to the grown-ups. It belonged to Lucas. And to the choices he would now have to face alone. Lucas had no idea how far he had walked since leaving the Moore house. The city in the early morning was still damp with mist, the streets empty as if deliberately avoiding him. In the pocket of his thin jacket was Vivian's letter, the only thing he had brought, not because it was a keepsake, but because it was the one thing that told him he had once been chosen. The car stopped at the edge of the old industrial zone, where abandoned warehouses stood shoulder to shoulder like unhealed scars. The driver said nothing as Lucas stepped out. Only as he was closing the door did the man speak one short sentence. You've got 10 minutes to change your mind. Lucas didn't look back. He knew this place, not from memory, but from instinct. Buildings without signs, iron doors locked tight, narrow alleys no one wanted to linger in. This was the kind of place that didn't belong to the present, it existed only to hide things that were never meant to disappear. The steel door opened after 3 measured knocks. The man standing in front of Lucas was shorter than he had imagined. His hair was heavily streaked with silver, his face deeply lined, not just from age, but from years without peaceful sleep. Yet when those eyes met Lucas's, the boy knew instantly, this was the man in the photograph. Richard Hale. No uniform. No insignia. Just a man standing in the shadows, looking at his son like someone studying living proof. You came, Hale said. Not a question. Lucas stood still. He didn't greet, didn't answer. He simply looked, as Eleanor had taught him, look before you decide. Who are you? Lucas asked. Hale's mouth curved just slightly. You already know. I know you're the man they call the enemy, Lucas said. I know you're the one whose name would keep my grandmother awake if she ever spoke it. Hale didn't flinch. He simply stepped aside, making way. Come in, he said. Since you're here, at least listen. Inside, the warehouse was bare but surprisingly clean. A wooden table, 2 chairs, a jug of water. No weapons in plain sight, but Lucas could feel the control in every detail. Hale sat first. Lucas sat across from him. "I'm not here to take you by force," Hale said. "If I wanted that, you never would have left the Moore house." Lucas looked straight at him. "Then what do you want?" Hale was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. "I want to know what they taught you about me." Lucas thought quickly. "Not much," he said. "Only that you were the cause of a lot of deaths." Hale nodded. "That's true. No denial. No excuses." That simple admission made Lucas pause. "Then why are you still alive?" Lucas asked. "While my mother is not?" Hale lowered his head. For one very brief moment, Lucas thought he saw something that might have been regret. "Because I ran," Hale said. "And because your mother stayed." Lucas clenched his fists. "Do you know," he said, voice tightening, "what my grandmother went through? Do you know how she raised me, under the eyes of people who saw me as a stain on history?" Hale looked up. "I know." "No," Lucas shook his head. "You don't know. You know tactics, deals, networks. You don't know what it feels like to be looked at like you're something left over from the past." Hale studied Lucas for a long time. "You're like your mother," he said. Lucas gave a dry laugh. "I didn't come here to hear you talk about her." "Then why did you come?" Hale asked. Lucas pulled Vivian's letter from his pocket and laid it on the table. "To ask," he said, "whether what she died to protect was really worth it." Hale looked at the letter but didn't touch it. "Vivian didn't die because of me," he said. "She died because of you." Lucas felt his throat close. "And because of what she carried," Hale continued. "Something she refused to hand over, even knowing what it would cost her." "What was it?" Lucas asked. Hale stood and walked to a metal panel on the wall. He tapped 3 times. A hidden compartment slid open, revealing a stack of old documents. "A list of the ones who are still alive," Hale said. "The ones who were never tried. The ones who want to rewrite the story of the war." Lucas stared at the papers as though they were something foreign. "And what do you want me to do with it?" he asked. Hale turned back to him. "I want you to decide." "You want me to continue?" Lucas asked. "To keep going with whatever you and my mother started?" "No," Hale said. "I want you to end it." Lucas laughed, a short, sharp sound. "You think I'll believe you?" "I don't need you to believe me," Hale said. "I only need you to understand." Lucas stood up. He couldn't sit still any longer. "You have no right," he said. "No right to call me your son. No right to put this weight on me." "I know," Hale answered. "That's why I'm not forcing you." A long silence followed. "I'll disappear," Hale said quietly. "After today. I won't come back. I won't look for you again." "And the list?" Lucas asked. "It's yours," Hale replied. Lucas looked at the man in front of him. The enemy his grandmother had hated. His biological father. A piece of history he had never asked for. "You chose war," Lucas said. "My mother chose me." Hale nodded, very slightly. "And what will you choose?" Hale asked. Lucas didn't answer right away. He picked up the stack of documents. It wasn't heavy. But he knew the real weight wasn't in the paper. "I won't become you," Lucas said. "And I won't become anyone's weapon." Hale closed his eyes. "Then that's enough," he said. When Lucas stepped out of the warehouse, the sky had turned a pale gray. No one followed. No shots rang out. No dramatic climax like the stories people tell about war. Just a boy standing on the boundary between past and future. And a choice, just beginning. Lucas returned to the Moore house as the afternoon light began to fade. The last rays of sun stretched across the familiar street, pale gold and quiet, as though this city had never known war, had never swallowed people whole in silence. The iron gate gave a single dry creak when Lucas pushed it open. The sound rang too clearly in the stillness, making him pause for a heartbeat. The house was still there, unchanged. The same worn steps. The same window where Eleanor always stood watching in the mornings. But Lucas knew something had shifted, not in the house, but inside himself. Eleanor sat in the living room, back straight, hands folded in her lap. She hadn't slept. She wasn't pretending to be busy. She simply sat there, as though she had been waiting a very long time. Lucas stood in the doorway. "I'm back," he said. Eleanor didn't turn right away. She drew a slow, deep breath, then rose carefully to her feet. "I knew you would come back," she said. There was no reproach in her voice. No flood of relief. Just a quiet fact, accepted. Lucas stepped inside. He laid his jacket over the back of a chair, a small, familiar gesture that hurt more than he expected. For years he had lived inside the routines Eleanor had built, like an invisible fence keeping the world at bay. Now he stood in the middle of that fence, unsure whether he was still inside or had already stepped out. "I met him," Lucas said. Eleanor gave the smallest nod. "I figured you would. You're not going to ask if I'm okay?" Lucas asked, a trace of tension in his voice. Eleanor looked at him. Her eyes seemed much older than they had that morning when he left. "I don't need to ask," she said. "If you're standing here, then you're still you." Lucas turned away. He didn't know how to respond to that kind of calm. "You knew he was alive," Lucas went on. "You've known for a long time." "Yes," Eleanor admitted. "And you never said a word." Lucas turned back to her. "Not once." Eleanor didn't avoid his gaze. "I thought silence would keep you safe," she said. "I was wrong." Lucas sat down across from her. Between them was only the old wooden table, yet it felt like an entire lifetime separated them. "You know what?" Lucas said, voice dropping low. "He wasn't what I expected." Eleanor said nothing. She let him speak. "He didn't apologize," Lucas continued. "He didn't make excuses. He just accepted it." "Acceptance doesn't erase what happened," Eleanor said. "I know," Lucas replied. "But he didn't try to force me either." Eleanor's brow creased slightly. "He gave me something," Lucas said, and placed the stack of documents on the table. "Names. The ones who are still out there." Eleanor looked at the papers, then back at Lucas. "And what are you going to do with them?" she asked. Lucas was silent for a long time. "I don't know yet," he said. "But I know one thing." "What's that?" Eleanor asked. "I don't want to live as a secret anymore," Lucas said. "And I don't want to become a symbol." Eleanor closed her eyes. When she opened them again, her voice was rougher. "I tried to keep you away from all of that," she said. "I thought I was doing the right thing." "You did do the right thing," Lucas told her. "In your way." Eleanor looked at him, surprised. "But you can't choose for me," Lucas continued. "And now, I need you to trust me." A long quiet fell between them. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees, whispering. "I want to know everything," Lucas said. "About my mother." Eleanor stood up. She walked to the old wooden cabinet, opened it, and took out a thin bundle of papers she had kept all these years, not out of duty, but because she hadn't had the courage to let them go. She placed them in front of Lucas. "Vivian's journal," she said. Lucas touched the pages. They were yellowed with age. "I never read it all the way through," Eleanor admitted. "I was afraid that if I did, I wouldn't be able to hate her anymore." Lucas opened the first page. The handwriting was slanted, gentle, yet full of resolve. "If someone is reading these words, perhaps the war has ended. But I know its consequences have not." Lucas read slowly. Each line felt like a soft blade, not drawing blood, but cutting deep. Vivian wrote about her days as a nurse. About passing messages in the dark. About Richard Hale, not as a hero, not as a monster, but as a man caught in a machine far larger than himself. And about Eleanor. She doesn't know. And perhaps she never will forgive. But if there is one thing I believe, it is this: she will protect my child better than anyone else could. Lucas looked up, eyes red. Did you know? He asked. My mother trusted you. Eleanor turned her face away. She couldn't let Lucas see her tears. I hated your mother, Eleanor said, voice breaking. Hated her so much I thought if she hadn't existed, Thomas would still be alive. Lucas didn't speak. He let the truth sit there, acknowledged. But when I held you, Eleanor went on, I understood something. War doesn't need more enemies. It needs people who will stop. Lucas stood and walked over to her. You stopped, he said. And you saved me. Eleanor looked at Lucas and, for the first time, saw not a child who needed protecting, but a young man standing firm on his own. What will you do with the names? She asked again. Lucas looked at the documents. I won't give them to people who want to keep the fighting going, he said. And I won't use them for revenge. Then what? Eleanor asked. Lucas took a deep breath. I'll make them public, he said. Not to accuse, but to end it. Eleanor was stunned. I know it's dangerous, Lucas continued. But if no one ever speaks the truth, war will always have a reason to come back. Eleanor looked at him for a very long time. Then she nodded. In that case, she said, I'll stand with you. Lucas smiled, for the first time since he had left home. The late afternoon sun poured into the living room, touching two people from two different generations, who had once stood on opposite sides of hatred. The war had taken so much from them. But at least, it had not taken away their ability to choose. On the morning Lucas decided to make the truth public, the city woke up the same way it always did. No sirens. No soldiers sealing off streets. No one knew that in just a few hours, the old, carefully covered cracks would finally have to show themselves. Lucas stood in front of the mirror for a long time. He didn't dress up in anything formal. He didn't try to look different. Just a plain shirt with the sleeves rolled neatly, the way Eleanor had always taught him. When you speak the truth, don't let your appearance distract people from the words. Eleanor stood behind him. You can still stop, she said quietly. Lucas shook his head. If I stop now, everything your mother died to protect will mean nothing. Eleanor said no more. She placed her hand lightly on his shoulder. Then go, she told him. And remember one thing, you're not speaking to destroy. You're speaking to end it. The press conference was held in a small room that quickly filled beyond capacity. Reporters. Government officials. Veterans who had fought on both sides. There were curious eyes, defensive eyes, and frightened eyes, because everyone sensed that today, some names would no longer be allowed to rest in peace. Lucas stepped up to the podium. He didn't carry the documents in his hands at first. He began with a calm voice, steady, without anger or tremor. My name is Lucas Moore. I am the son of a woman who was sentenced for treason. And I am also the son of an officer who fought for the other side in the war that just ended. The room erupted in murmurs. Lucas raised a hand for quiet. I'm not standing here to apologize for anyone. I'm not standing here to accuse anyone. He paused for a breath. I'm standing here because war doesn't end when the shooting stops. It only ends when we're brave enough to call things by their true names. Lucas placed the stack of documents on the table. This is a list of people who are still alive. Not so we can hunt them down. Not so we can take revenge. But so we can stop using silence as a way to keep the war going. The questions came fast and furious. Some people stood up to protest. Others demanded the documents be sealed immediately. A few called Lucas a new kind of traitor. He didn't argue back. He only added one final sentence. I didn't choose my father's side. And I won't live off my mother's sacrifice just to keep lying. I choose a generation that doesn't need war to define who we are." The room dissolved into chaos. But what Lucas didn't see, because he was facing forward, was the quiet eyes in the back. The people who were simply tired of living two lives. The people who understood that truth can hurt, but hiding it hurts even more. In the days that followed, the city didn't explode into violence the way some had feared. But it didn't stay peaceful either. Old investigations were quietly reopened. Certain titles were suspended. For the first time in decades, some people had to answer questions they had spent years avoiding. Lucas was called in for questioning many times. But no one could charge him. Because all he had done was speak. Eleanor watched everything from a distance. She never appeared in public. But every evening she still left the living room light on, a quiet sign that Lucas always had a place to come home to. One afternoon Lucas received the last news about Richard Hale. He had left the country. No message. No demands. No attempt to reach out. Lucas read the report slowly, then folded it away. "He kept his word," he said. Eleanor nodded. Some promises only need to be kept once. A few months later, a small memorial was quietly built on the edge of the city. No symbols of any side. No list of victories. Just one simple line carved into stone. For those who died, and for those who lived long enough to find the courage not to repeat it. Lucas stood before the stone for a very long time. He laid down 2 flowers. One for Vivian. One for Thomas. No difference. No comparison. Eleanor stood a little behind him, silent. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly. Lucas shook his head. "I couldn't choose where I came from," he said. "But I can choose what I leave behind." Many years later, when the city had changed enough that people no longer spoke of the war as an open wound, Lucas left. Not to escape. But to live a life that wasn't defined by what happened before he was born. Eleanor saw him off at the gate. "I won't hold you anymore," she said. Lucas smiled. "You never really held me." He turned and walked away. Eleanor stood there a very long time. The war had taken her husband. It had taken her son. And it had almost taken her humanity. But in the end, it was the child of the enemy who taught her how to let go. That evening Eleanor opened the old wooden box one last time. She took out Vivian's letter and read the familiar lines again. "If one day my child lives free, then my death was not in vain." Eleanor folded the letter closed. Outside, the city lights came on. Not bright and dazzling. Not showy. Just enough light so people could see one another, without needing to ask which side they stood on.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. See you again.